Hello friends, welcome. In this video, we'll be discussing the classification of psychopathology. Now friends, let us start with the definition of psychopathology. It's a science that studies and diagnoses the psychological disorders. Remember, in psychology, we do not use the word problem or the disease. We categorically use the word psychological disorders. So the correct definition is to diagnose and studies these psychological disorders. Let us start with the introductory part. The classification is a very important phenomena as per science is concerned. Why classification is done? You can call it as a central component of science. In classification, the categories are constructed where the people, the object, or the events that have similar defining characteristics are assigned in these categories. Now let us take as the category of the plant. All those objects that meet the certain characteristics of being a plant are only included in the category of a plant. Why it is done? To understand, to manage well, to study, and ease of handling. Taking cue from this classification, the psychological disorders are also being classified into different categories. Because it is easier to diagnose, it is easier to find out the causes, to design the best interventions and come up with the optimal solutions. This is the basic idea of classification. If we look back in the history, we'll find that the oldest systematic classification of diseases, I'm not talking about the psychological disease, all diseases are found in Ayurveda, the ancient medical science that has come up in India. Ayurveda. Ayu, age. Ved means knowledge. The basic fundamental point of the Ayurveda is to enhance the quality of life of the individual and the number of years he or she lives. Now the question can come, why there is a need to increase the age of an individual? To get the moksha. In Buddhist term, to reach to the door of the nirvana. For that, your body should be healthy, physically fit, psychologically fit. So that was the point for which the concept of whole Ayurveda has emerged from the Indian civilization. The publication of International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems 1, which was later known as the ICD-1 by the WHO in 1900, initiated the process of classification of diseases. Surprisingly, mental disorders or the psychological problems fails to find its much needed place in ICD-1. What does it indicate? It indicates the people were not taking the psychological disorders seriously at that time too. Maybe other reasons too. That is my perspective. But it took almost 49 years for the mental disorders to find their due place in the ICD system. This means it was given the space in ICD 6. The ICD-10, which was published in 1992 by the World Health Organization, is the outcome of Copenhagen Conference that was held in 1982. The chapter 5F of ICD-10 deals with the classification of mental disorders. The latest publication of World Health Organization is the ICD-11 that was published in 2019. That also contains the classification of mental disorders under the chapter 6. And the heading has been given that mental, behavioral and neurodevelopmental disorders. Now, before starting the classification approaches, let us understand the basic terms which are used by the psychopathologist. But we have to study these terms in comparison to the common terms used in the medical science, because we are fully aware about the terms of the medical science. For example, psychopathologists use the word client in place of a common word that has been used in medical science, the patient. We use the word disorder in place of the disease. In place of medicines or the prescriptions, the psychopathologist or the psychologist use the word talking cure. And in place of your diagnosis, systems, etiology, we use the word formulations. Remember, these terms have their own positive connotations and unconsciously have their positive impact not only on the client, also on the practicing psychologist. Because we deal with the clients, not the patients. We deal with the disorders, not the diseases. This kind of thinking gives a positive perspective and helps in effectively dealing with the psychological disorders. Now let us focus on the approaches. The first was the categorical approach, dimensional approach, and the prototypical approach. Categorical approach. This approach assumes that each mental disorder is distinct and exclusive from another. It's a rigid type of approach to classify the mental disorders. A categorical approach to classification primarily assumes that distinctions among members of different categories are qualitative. And Kraepelin classified the psychological disorders from a biological perspective for the first time. He said that every mental disorder have one defining criteria, which everybody in that particular category is required to meet it. For example, schizophrenia means if a particular mental disorder is to be placed in a particular category, that mental disorder has to perfectly match the defining criteria of that category. In other words, that particular defining characteristics will decide whether that disorder will be part of that category or not. Now the dimensional approach. In this approach, various cognitive dimensions of the client are observed and quantified using the rating scales. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 7, 1 to 10, whatever may be the case. Suppose a client is suffering from some kind of a problem. We do not know which type of mental problem that individual is undergoing. So what we'll do is, we'll design a rating scale and we'll assume that by the symptoms of that individual is likely to suffer from the depression. Okay. So on the rating scale, we'll give a category 1 to 5. 5 for the severe depression, 4 for the significant, 3 for the mild, 2 for the borderline, 1 for the insignificant or the average or the mild, something we can design. And we'll offer that rating scale to various psychologists and ask them to rate the symptoms of the individual on this rating scale. So what they do is, They will rate as per their experience, as their learning, as per their knowledge, that particular level of that individual. This way, that mental disorder is quantified. One more point I want to add here. The basic assumption of this approach is that the cognitive components, such as your personality traits or your intelligence, they all exist in continuity. This means they are continuous variables and they can be quantified using the rating scales. Now, the prototypical approach. The approach that lies between the categorical approach and the dimensional approach. You know, categorical approach is the rigid one. Dimensional approach is too much flexible. But prototypical approach lies between both these rigid and flexible approach. It has the qualities of the both the approaches. This approach identifies certain defining features of a disorder. They are the prominent characteristics of particular disorder and allows for the existence of other normal features in the individual along with that defining feature, because it's a flexible one and other terms rigid one. It's our space for that particular defining feature and for the normal features too. This approach considers that an individual to be included in a particular category should at least meet the minimum characteristics or the criterion to be included in the particular category. Suppose an individual is suffering from one mental disorder that is commonly known as the depression. To be included that individual or that disorder in depressive category, the individual has to meet at least 3 symptoms out of 5 important symptoms of the depression. See here, they have defined the 5 criteria. Out of that, they were given some flexibility, that is at least 3 should be met by the individual, such as the individual should be depressed condition all the day, significant weight loss or the gain 5% at least of the body weight in a month, likely to suffer from the severe insomnia, acute fatigue without doing any physical activities, and sustained and continuous feeling of worthlessness, hopelessness, and the helplessness. Out of these 5 characteristics, the individual should meet at least 3 to be classified under the category of depression. So that was the prototypical approach of classification. Now, if you look at the history of classification of modern mental disorders, that historical part starts from the Hippocrates. He classified the mental illness or the disorders into delirium, mania, paranoia, hysteria, and melancholia. Then came the Philippinian, the Frenchman, who classified mental disorders on the basis of functional disorders of the nervous system. His focus was on the nervous system. He described the 4 functional disorders, that is dementia, mania, melancholia, and idiotism. Then came the Carl Ludwig Karlbaum. He differentiated between organic and non-organic mental disorders. He meant to say by this that mental disorders can also be classified into organic one and non-organic. Emil Kraepelin classified mental disorders on the basis of clinical features of disorders, such as the cause, course, and outcome in manic depressive psychosis and dementia. In this historical development, then came the Jürgen Bühler. He combined the Kraepelin and Mervyn approaches and classified mental disorders on the basis of psychopathological processes. Means there exist some psychopathological processes that leads to the development of mental disorders. The ICD-11 published by the World Health Organization in 2019. The chapter 6 of this ICD-11 is marked by the heading Mental, Developmental and Neurodevelopmental Disorders. ICD-11 considers these as a syndrome which are characterized by the clinical significant disturbances in an individual's cognition system, emotional regulation, and behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, social, professional, vocational, family, or other domains of the individual. When the disturbance in these domains is significant, then only particular that syndrome is classified as the mental disorder. If particular disorder interferes with the day-to-day life of the individual, such as social, emotional, psychological, family, etc., etc., then only we can term that individual is suffering from some kind of mental disorder. These are my references. If you want to study more about the classification of psychopathology, just read them and you will gain more insight. As far as the content and the presentation style of this video, if you like and love it, tell to others. But if you have any question, any query, any doubt, or any critical comment to make, let me know. You can post a comment in my comment box or you can email me at wamasujit@yahoo.com. And dear friends, do not forget to watch my next discussion on the need for the classification of psychopathology. Though we have discussed some part of it, but we'll discuss in that video in detail.